because I'm trying to finish my master paper, and after the presentation of this morning, I will sort of discard the fact, well, most of the things that Laura said, and will do that in a PhD project, because otherwise I will never finish my master paper before our next kid is born, so I definitely need to do that, because after that I won't have time. It's due end of February. So, anyway, why Jacques Roubaud? Because, I mean, in what everybody is talking about poetry, and as if we know what poetry is. And I thought it was very interesting to sort of hear from Xavier that at a certain moment he said, like, yeah, you have an oral sense to it and you have a written sense to it. So a poem exists already in two different forms. So in my master paper, at this moment, I finished part one almost at about 80 pages. And there are still 3 parts in principle to come. And one of the things is that to define what my idea was to define visual poetry, because I found all the definitions of visual poetry sort of a bit difficult. And then you have, at this moment, I'm even considering redefining even the title of my thesis, which is Visual Poetry, a Definition, and 5 visual poets from Flanders, excuse me, but that was one of my promoters who definitely wanted the Flemish to sort of be highlighted. But anyway, because Mr. Denker wrote 900 pages with the title Optische Poëzie, where he puts visual poetry, concrete poetry, because you have the problem. If you talk about visual poetry, so when I send in my first draft of this, of my paper, one of my promoters, because I have 2 of them, one of my promoters says like, yeah, you defined visual poetry, can you now define concrete poetry? I was sort of like, excuse me, but can you read the other 60-ish pages? Because, I mean, my idea of visual poetry is that it's the envelope term for visual poetry, concrete poetry, and scores of sound poetry that can be seen as visual poetry. Yeah. So, but I'm considering to sort of tackle the thing and use the nice function that you have in the word search and replace visual poetry with optic poetry. And my German is very bad, so I must admit that I haven't gone through all the 900 and something pages yet of Klaus-Peter Denker. But I'm definitely considering going for that title, and now that I'm doing my 3rd year of master paper writing. And every year there is a book that comes out and I need to change. So I need really to finish, discard Laura's presentation. But you need to sort of see what poetry is, you need to know what poetry is, and you have 1,100 different sort of theories and definitions and whatsoever. But the one definition where I needed only, well, I didn't need to, but I did anyway. I needed to add something very small to it, was Jacques Roubaud, and who states that poetry exists in language and in poems. A poem is the union of 4 forms. And then he goes on, it's a bit like your vertebrae, because he makes it with different points. So, and then that was point 11, so now point 12. A quartet of forms and a score. So a score in like a musical score, and it's a quartet of forms. Next point, 13. I think a poem has two internal and two external aspects. So you go back to the 4 forms. And then on point 14 he says two external aspects. The written form, the oral form. Both are fixed, the oral as well as the written, and constitute the score. Of course, there are many possible executions of the oral form, performances, just as there are many possible executions of the written form, written performances. The score is the coupling of these two external forms of a poem. For me, the both always exist, though one perhaps only virtually. When you read a poem, for instance, just for yourself, you just have it on a piece of paper. Plus, let's skip that part, you can read the book later on. 15, two internal aspects. The written form, but with a small w and with a capital R. The written form, and then he makes between brackets written with a small w and a big R, the capital R. A term coined out of necessity for this purpose. Orally, the homonym of written. So it sounds the same, but it means something else. And the aural, with A-U-R-A-L form, aural holds the same homonymic relation with oral as written does with written. So, which means, we go on and a little bit further, what means that aural is the fact that you hear it, whilst oral is the fact that you say it. Written is the fact with a small w and a small r means that you write it, and written with a capital R and a small w means that you are reading it. So that's the other. This is one of the things that you better read on paper than somebody reading it to you. Internal to what? To the person receiving the poem. The reader is included in defining poetry as a quartet of forms. And then we have our big friend Duchamp again, who said that the audience is completing an artwork. So Duchamp is never far away, as is Hans de Wolf, but that is something completely different. And then the external aspects of a poem are interpersonal. They are transmissible to practically anyone who speaks and reads the language in which a given poem is composed. And the internal aspects are personal. They are in the mind of the reader-listener, essentially non-transmissible from one person to the other. So you make your own meaning, the meaning that you make from what you read is individual, because of the fact that you have a certain history, a certain background, a certain mental state, you have read certain books, you have seen certain movies, whatsoever. They are in the mind of the reader. Listen, essentially non-transmitted. They are always in movement within memory. And so that's what I just said. Movement of images of thoughts. Ultimately, the external written form with small letters all is idle, but not the internal mental page that constitutes the written form with a capital R. And there's then a next point that he makes: there is no poem without reading. And in the interior reading, as in the external aspects, one form confronts the other and they collide. So for me, this was the one definition of poetry that I thought was, after 60 pages of definitions of poetry almost, was something that my only difference that I think is that for his external forms, with performance being within the two external forms, I think performance is possibly a fifth form of poetry. A fifth, so that you have a quintet of forms and not a quartet of forms. Why? Because during a performance, and I'm looking now a bit at Stefan with, sorry, because during performance you have this sort of non-linguistic language that adds to the form of poetry. And why is that? Because, for instance, I'm going back to sort of the DNA basis of visual poetry or experimental poetry. In 1913, in Russia, there was a poet called Gnedov, and he published as last poem in a book of 13 poems. His last poem was an empty page. And in different accounts of his performances of this last poem, we at least have two different forms of him performing his last poem. So one is that he does this, and then says thank you, or bows, and the other one says that he just does this. So really sort of a vertical